Hi, my name is Jennifer Neal, and my paper is called A Wild Gesture of Warning, Transgender Issues in Rebecca Harding Davis's Life in the Iron Mills. Please bear with me. I'm having health issues and can't be there with you today, so hopefully this will go smoothly. While the term race is being interpreted in increasingly cultural terms in contemporary literary discourse, an assumption prevailed in the early 19th century that physical and non-physical characteristics of race resulted from biological differences. To Civil War-era America, race was an important topic of discussion. As Americans found themselves segregated geographically, socially, and politically by slavery issues, authors and critics felt free to discuss slavery, and thus race, but tended to avoid the debate over class or gender inequality, in part due to a nationalist sense of pride in the U.S.'s decided rejection of England's rigid class structure and the injustice inherent therein. In an effort to secure their own American dream of freedom through financial and thus social success, businessmen gained cheap labor by dangling in front of the desperate immigrant an unattainable carrot, transcendence through hard work. Several of Davis's characters unknowingly defy not only racial but gender lines as well, exposing the imprecision of also defining gender according to sex. In a unique borderland position, Davis herself writes from a third culture perspective that she is not unsettled by. Life in the Iron Mills exposes an injustice that will repeat itself in future private and public realms. And the Choral Woman issues a warning about the inhumanity of stratified class, race, and gender systems, the power of which is destructive even to capitalistic efforts. I argue that Life in the Iron Mills illustrates the way in which rigid stratification of a class structure in an individualistic society both necessitates and prohibits transgressing accepted role divisions, specifically between genders, and in the process, Hugh Wolf's struggle and demise foreshadow the emergence of gender identity crises, like those experienced today in social arenas where human value is being determined. Life in the Iron Mills both exposed the emerging class system in the U.S. and presented a carefully veiled condemnation through acceptable racial terminology as a code for class. The initial publication's very audience, the white middle-class capitalist, was criticized for enslaving his immigrant brother with industrial labor and killing him with consumerism. The critical platform stands on three legs. First, the white middle class sees immigrant laborers as belonging to a different biological race, as being essentially black. Second, this perception is intrinsically flawed. And third, any third culture identity that exists between black and white, human and dehumanized, or man and woman denies transcendence from the perceived state. The human being, represented in Davis's story by the character of Hugh Wolf, is enslaved by what is an assumption of appropriate race, class, and gender roles. On one side of the mill town is a Negro-like river slavishly bearing its burden day after day. On the other side is a town with larger streets, a white marble church filled with people to whom the world had given so much. Davis plunges readers right between the two, into a muddy town that belongs to neither side, populated by what critic Stephen Nadler calls the hybrid Anglo-Saxon, an amalgamation of different class, regional, and national blood types. The narrator describes the mill community in blended colors such as gray, black and white, or brown, dirty and clean, or brown and white. The town is permeated by gray smoke from the mill's foundries. Smoke everywhere, writes Davis. It settles in black, slimy pools in the muddy streets, on the wharves and boats, even on the wings of a porcelain angel in the house from which the narrator looks out. Quote, "The idiosyncrasy of this town is smoke," end quote, she says, "smoke that comes to rest on the dull, besotted faces of the masses of mill hands who live their dull lives, walking the muddy road to and from their mills. Their, quote, skin and muscle and flesh begrimed with smoke and ashes, breathing an air saturated with fog and grease and soot," end quote. Eric Shockett likens the blackening of Hughes and the other mill hands' physical bodies to British industrial fiction, and in particular Matthew Estey's Tit for Tat, in which young white boys are sold into the labor market as chimney sweeps, turn black from the soot, and die, He points out that, quote, "It is, in fact, never completely clear whether the boys die from their labor or from their blackness," end quote. In the same way, Davis's mill hands are physically blackened from labor and dying. Hugh's body is described as filthy and grimy, half naked, and half covered in clothes stiffened with soot. His skin muddy with grease and ashes, and his face yellow with consumption, or TB, tuberculosis. When the white men come to visit the mill, they refer to Hugh and the other men as the, quote, "lowest deep, thieves, Magdalens, Negroes, and degraded souls," end quote. However, life in the iron mills is not simply an Americanized tit for tat. It is a critique of the incompatibility of a white national identity that ignored the whiteness of its immigrants. Stephen Nadler says that Davis used racial tropes to destabilize the dissociative logic on which a, quote, "racialized Anglo-American identity," end quote, was beginning to form, and questioned the formation of an identity that depended on prevalent theories of, quote, race, and on the construction of a stable white New England body that involved no borderline genealogies or indeterminate, deviant identifications, end quote, all in an era defined by immigration. I would take that assessment 2 steps further and say that identity formation then depended on prevalent rigid theories of class and gender as well. By the 1860s, the non-black working class in America was almost synonymous with an immigrant class because it was comprised mostly of young men from Germany, the United Kingdom, and Ireland, and yet was often referred to as black because of the dirty nature of their labor. By adopting this racialized depiction, Davis's story has formed a ruse which allows the audience to expect to discover black slaves, but surprises them with the irony of white servitude. It delivers industrial laborers whose bodies mimic the physical determinism of chattel servitude by bearing similar marks of bondage and oppression. She essentially introduces to her audience white slaves, and the lace of ambiguity is revealed. In the midst of this darkened laboring town, quote, "in the thickest of the nightmare fog and mud and foul effluvia," end quote, readers find Hugh Wolfe, a Welsh immigrant and puddler in one of the iron mills who is white yet enslaved. Hugh's Welsh blood, Davis writes, shows, quote, "in the slight angular body and sharply cut facial lines, and is pure and unmixed," end quote, like the thoroughbred gentlemen who visit the mill. His father is described as a pale, meek little man with a white face, and his cousin Deborah has pale, bleared eyes and a dull, washed-out looking face. Their bloodline is pure to such a degree that it makes them unsuitable for physical labor. The Welsh are a, quote, "trifle more filthy, their muscles not so brawny, they stoop more and skulk along like beaten hounds," end quote. According to Michelle Mock, in Women, Nature, and the White Plague, the consumption with which Hugh is afflicted is itself a symbol of whiteness. Also called the White Plague, the tuberculosis epidemic was most common among the white race and actually became a sign of gentility. White middle-class women were even known to affect a consumptive cough in order to appear more delicate and refined. Surely, in a story filled with codified language, the very term consumption fulfills a second purpose, which is clear if we transpose consumption with consumerism. Hugh's illness alone is an expose on the ravaging effects of capitalistic industrial labor. Hugh, imprisoned in the mill, afflicted with the white man's plague, is a product of capitalism and is dying from consumerism. Just as the sunshine over their town is veiled by smoke from the mills, so Hugh's Welsh family and entire class are thwarted by a system that blackens and enslaves immigrants. The figure he sculpts of coral is the cry of what he might have otherwise been under a fairer, clearer system, or as he might become under the current one if given the help he needs and requests. In other words, the figure, quote, "a woman, white, of giant proportions, crouching on the ground, her arms flung out in some wild gesture of warning, with pale, vague lips that tremble with a terrible question," end quote, represents Hugh's potential to become what is perceived of as white. The whiteness of the sculpture is what draws the attention that Hugh himself cannot when the group of white gentlemen visit the mill. As the men discuss the business of the mill, amusing themselves by comparisons with Dante's Inferno, they are suddenly startled at the sight of the coral figure. Shocked and aghast at her presence in this literal hell, their conversation soon turns to art and democracy and the possibility of a man like Hugh transcending his current labor state to, quote, make himself anything he chooses, end quote. The freedom for all men to cross over slips out of reality down toward the line of farce when Hugh quietly asks the men for the means to escape his enslavement and is refused. The scene echoes the narrator's prior description or conviction of the mill as a, quote, scene of hopeless discomfort and veiled crime, end quote. Davis makes no stand against black slavery per se, but by exposing white skin under black marks of bondage, her story forms what Dawn Henwood calls an attack on the white slavery of Northern-style capitalism, perpetuated by Emersonian transcendental thought. In her autobiography, Bits of Gossip, Davis says that the inhabitants of her hometown, Wheeling, Virginia, a borderland between the North and South, could see many issues from both sides. In contrast, while the members of the Atlantic coterie, which included Ralph Waldo Emerson and much of the Atlantic Monthly's audience, quote, thought they were guiding the real world, they stood quite outside of it and never would see it as it was, end quote. From her unique borderland position, Davis exercises a self-described, quote, perverse inclination to the other side of the question, end quote. She asserts that whiteness can be as terrifying and appalling as blackness. For Davis, a critique of American capitalism and white national identity may have necessitated a parallel critique of American transcendental thought then, the tenets of which endorse the implicitly, quote, white, male, elite, disembodied subject of Ralph Waldo Emerson's nature, end quote. That quote was by Michelle Mock. Davis repudiated transcendentalism as an imperialistic enterprise that overlooked class and ethnicity by its required disembodiment. In Life in the Iron Mill, she confronts the hopelessness for the non-native white man to escape the confines of his class, let alone corporeality. For while, quote, 19th century rhetoric equated white manhood with transcending and replacing the material body, white laborers, by the physical nature of their work, were confined to the body and thus transfigured into corporeal machines. White manhood, Mark Seltzer points out, in bodies and machines, was marked in this culture of consumption by moving beyond bodily needs to unnatural or artificial wants, a position unreachable to immigrant laborers like Davis's mill hands. Davis also destroys the notion that middle-class white manhood was a homogeneous white national identity. In the mill's visit scene, when Hugh recognizes that there is a difference between his white manhood and that of the visiting men, one man, Mitchell's whiteness, flashes before Wolfe's vivid, quote, poetic sense, end quote, his delicate, sinewy limbs in harmony with all Hugh knows of beauty or truth, and causes Hugh to look upon himself with sudden loathing and sickness. Not only does Hugh miss the transcendentalist mark for white, elite, and disembodied, his persona also conveys a femininity disruptive to the assumption that all the mill hands were poor, Negro-like, corporeal machines. Deborah, to whom Hugh is kind but otherwise disinterested, recognizes the finer nature of the man, quote, which made him among his fellow workmen something unique, set apart. She knew that down under all the vileness and coarseness of his life, there was a groping passion for whatever was beautiful and pure, end quote. And although the assumption may be that the woman is the finer or more beautiful of the sexes, between Deb and Hugh it is not so. She knew, in spite of all his kindness, that there was that in her face and form which made him loathe the sight of her. His soul sickened with disgust at Deb's deformity. He is not a man's man in any sense. Physiologically, he is weak with thin muscles, and around the mill he is ascribed a girly man, his nickname being Molly Wolf. He is set apart by others as a feminine man, but that inner uniqueness exists as well and exposes itself as feminine. In place of the, quote, instinct vigor of a man, end quote, Hugh has become haggard and meek, a man with a woman's face. The poetic sense, this inner artist, sets himself apart behaviorally as well as physiologically. He watches Mitchell, one of the white gentlemen, with a, quote, quick pleasure, end quote, and attention to detail that he does not afford those he knows, whether women or men.